Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Behind me I got a Chevy Silverado 2500 heavy duty. This thing has around 40,000 miles. It's primarily used as a plow, used a couple months out of the year. Now we're going to be replacing the front wheel bearing on this truck. It has gone bad, giving us an ABS issue. So we're going to go ahead and replace that today. Now before we begin, if you guys haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and hit the subscribe button down below. It definitely helps the channel grow. And with that said, let's go ahead and begin on the repairs. Where I like to begin on these is go ahead and remove the front wheel wherever you're going to be working on it. And this very first step that I'm going to do here, guys, is optional. It's up to you. I just prefer not to fight the steering rack and the gears when I'm doing this. So where I always start off is go ahead and remove the outer tie rod. Basically, it allows me to be able to swing this back and forth to gain access to my wheel bearing bolts and everything that I'm going to be working on here. So the first step that I always like to do is go ahead and take this off. Now you don't necessarily have to remove it, but like I said, it just makes life a lot easier if you do so right off the bat. And after I remove the nut, typically what you're supposed to do is just take a hammer and give it a couple solid hits. And your tie rod should be free. Now the job is going to be a lot easier. Now, in order to gain access to our wheel bearing here, what we're going to have to do is go ahead and remove our caliper as an assembly. Since we dislocated our steering tie rod, you guys can see this can freely move now. It just makes it a lot easier. Now, to disconnect and remove our caliper off here, what I like to do is go ahead and take my screwdriver, and I like to decompress the piston a little bit, give a little space to the pads and the rotors. Because when you remove this as a complete assembly with the bracket, what will happen sometimes is the pads may interfere with reinstallation if you don't compress that piston, giving yourself that extra room. So I always do so. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the caliper retaining bolts from the bracket. If you want to separate these and remove the caliper first, then the bracket, you can do so. But when it comes to this truck, I'm not going to be doing brakes or anything of that nature, so it makes more sense and it's less work to just go ahead and separate it as one piece by the bracket. Now that I have everything loose, what I like to do is take my caliper hook here and just remove your assembly. And be careful because these can be quite heavy. And what I always like to do here, and I don't know if my light is going to allow it, so let me get this out of the way. And again, you don't have to do it this way, it's whatever you prefer, guys. I just hook it up on my strut tower right up here. That'll help keep it out of the way in the meantime. Now that we got the caliper out of our way up here, what we're going to be doing, guys, is disconnecting our ABS speed sensor wire. This will come with the bearing. So what you're going to want to do is follow this wire up. Now my caliper is currently kind of hanging on it. But if you follow it up and you go up to here, typically you will find this connector. And what you're going to want to do is go ahead and disconnect it and get that ready. And then it's going to be clipped along the side of the frame here with little push connectors. Just go ahead and grab like a trim panel popping tool and get those removed and get them out of your way. So that way your wire is not going to be attached to anything. Now that I went ahead and I got my wire unclipped, you'll find 3 clips on here. One will be right up here, one along this side of the control arm, and one right up here by the strut tower, or shock tower I should say. The reason why I removed this right from the get-go is because if you forget this and you unbolt your bearing, it's going to hang you up and kind of tug you back, so I just do it first. The next step is going to be to go ahead and remove your rotor. Surprisingly, this rotor is actually loose. I don't know if someone's been in here before, maybe did a service. It's a good thing that it comes off easy. That means I don't got to beat up on it. Now that the rotor is out of the way, we have our wheel bearing exposed, at least the front facing portion of it. What happens on these a lot, guys, is the bearing itself can be fine, but inside here, if you guys will see, I don't know how well the camera's going to pick it up. This is your ABS speed sensor, and the tone wheel and everything is built into the bearing. It's called an integral unit. It's all in one. I don't know exactly what happens if water gets in there, the tone wheel goes bad, or the ABS speed sensor isn't reading good, but they always seem to fail. And what happens is when you're at a low speed situation, the wheel speeds are going to be different on the front wheels. It's going to think that the truck is slipping or one of the wheels is slipping, and it basically activates ABS, and you'll get like a judder or a vibration in your brake pedal, and the truck will kind of go and stop until, you know, it basically doesn't do anything except stop. The next step that I like to do is take some penetrating oil and hit the wheel bearing on the bolts and in the flange area, just so you can hopefully get it to penetrate through. Now, I haven't done a wheel bearing on this truck. All I have as far as background info or anything on it is that this is a plow truck, and it's very low mileage and it does sit, but it also has a salter and a pretty big blade on it. So this thing may be rotted on here pretty good. We're gonna find out. I'm gonna go ahead and let it sit for a couple minutes, let that penetrating oil do its thing, and then what we're gonna do when we come back is go ahead and try to loosen up the wheel bearing bolts from the backside. This thing will either fight us or it will come off. Now, the rotor did come off fairly easy, as you guys saw. Maybe we'll get lucky, but we're gonna find out here in a few minutes. So I've let my bolts soak for a little bit now, and I've grabbed my 3/8 wrench with a 15 millimeter, and I've tried to crank these off, and they're actually really frozen on there. Since I do not want to break anything, guys, what I'm going to wind up doing is heating up my hub flange here to get them off with my torch. Now, a lot of you may say, hey, you just switch up to a 1/2-inch breaker bar. The thing is, I don't want these bolts to break or snap, simply because I do have to reuse them. So what I'm going to try to do here, guys, is get you guys in on this angle, and you will see the bolts are located right here. I'm going to go ahead and use my torch to heat up this flange area and hopefully see if we can get them off. So I got my acetylene torch in hand, and let me go ahead and turn everything on here and get my torch dialed up. If you're from the salt belt areas, you know exactly what we're going to be doing right now. So we're going to heat up our flange, and it is going to be prone to lighting up on fire because we do have penetrating oil, guys. So don't let that freak you out. This is just what happens when you torch. So we're going to go ahead and get this nice and cherry here. And I like to do these one at a time. Just get them nice and hot, you know, so that way it starts glowing red. And once you're at that point, which is right about there, what I like to do is go ahead and turn off our flame. And now let's see if this will work. We'll put our wrench on here, and there you go. I don't know if you guys caught that little puff of smoke. That's actually the rust breaking free from there. And what we're gonna do is go ahead and drive this one out. Now, I would sit here and show you all 4 of these guys because there are 4 bolts. There's gonna be one here, and 2 on the other side, exactly in the same arrangement. For time saving purposes on the video, I'm gonna go ahead and just go ahead and remove all of them now that I've showed you how to do this one. Alright guys, I apologize because in the last clip, it was kind of hard to hear me over the torch, but you guys saw me heat this up, and what I was saying is that if you're from the Midwest or the Rust Belt areas, you're familiar with this process. You're just going to heat it up till it gets cherry red, and then go ahead and, you know, put your wrench on there and break it loose. Now, I've already gone ahead and I got all of my bolts out here. As you guys will see, they were all needing to be torched. You guys can see here, everything is torched up, and all of our bolts are off. Now, these bolts are pretty sturdy. I'll show you guys one of them here. They actually do have a nice thickness to them. They don't really break that easily, but I have snapped these off before and stripped ends. That's why I'm choosing to heat it, because realistically, that dark end right here, that's all that goes into the bearing that holds it. Everything else is pretty much freed up, as you'll see. So now that we got those off, since we have a 4-wheel drive unit on this one, we have this dust cap that we have to remove to be able to gain access to our axle nut. If you have a, let's say, rear-wheel drive truck, you don't necessarily have an axle up front or this dust cap. I do have a video on a GM vehicle that's rear-wheel drive where we do replace the front wheel bearing without an axle or anything, and I'll probably have that video up by now if you guys want to search that. But it's identically the same except for this added step where you got to remove the boot, the axle nut, and separate the axle by pushing it inward from the hub. or the wheel bearing, whatever you prefer to call it. So let me go ahead and get a tool here to get this cap off, and that's going to be our next step in this one. So now that we are ready to remove that cap, what I simply use is a flat chisel bit and a hammer. And there's really no easy way to do this, guys. I don't know if they do make a tool. I've heard of some companies making tools for this, but however, this is how I get them off. And then what I'm going to do is just slowly hit it here and just try to wedge this in here to break off a tab or a corner. Sometimes these will take time because obviously you don't want to destroy this. I have to reuse it. So I'm going to go ahead because it's going to make a lot of noise me tapping on it. I'm going to go ahead and get this off simply by getting this wedge in there and peeling it off a little bit at a time just to get it off nice and easy. Alright guys, so I've kind of done most of my hammering here. I try to keep it just this one area. The lip kind of got pushed in, but I'm going to go ahead and bend that back once I go ahead and reinstall it. And I'll show you guys how I seal this up so no moisture or water gets in here afterwards, because you're not always going to be able to find the cap without ordering it from the dealer. So now that I was able to basically get in here and get some gap on it, I'm going to take my chisel bit and hit outward. And as you guys can see, it comes off very easily. Now notice the damage isn't on the actual lip part here that's on the inner surface. It's just this outer tab, and what I do on these is I'll just go ahead and straighten this back out so I can reuse it. As you can see, it's not that bad. Now that we went ahead and we got our dust boot off, what we're going to do is take our 35mm and go ahead and remove this axle. Or axle nut, I should say, not axle. Now make sure you guys don't lose this retaining ring or pressure ring, whatever you prefer to call it. You do have to reinstall this and reuse it. You cannot just put the nut back on there without this, because your axle will not be located correctly. Now that we went ahead and removed our axle nut, you got to make sure that this axle will slide in and out of here freely. The easiest way to do that is I just take my thumb and I push back on it. And you guys can kind of hear it is moving, but just to show you guys a little bit closer, it is moving in and out. It's there as well. So that's actually a good thing. The axle is not binding on there. Now, we've gone through quite a few things, and so far this hasn't been overly difficult. But this is the part that will either make or break this job, because now we actually have to remove the wheel bearing off of the knuckle assembly. Now, from experience in the Midwest, guys, these don't come off that easy. These will typically fight you simply because they do have a tendency to stick in there. So the way I like to do this is I get my big hammer and I'm going to take my axle nut. I'm going to spin it on a couple turns. This is just in case this actually does wind up coming off easy. I don't go ahead and launch it across the shop and hit the camera or, you know, myself. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and take my hammer. I'm going to hit the hub flange from the back here. This may be a little loud. I'm going to show you guys a couple hits on how I do it, and then I'm going to go ahead and try it off camera as well. So this one, I can tell you right off the bat, is going to take some beating. So what I'm going to do off camera is I'm going to do exactly what you guys just saw right now, while I hit it with some penetrating oil in between and just try to unseize it. They do make tools that you can remove the lug nuts and kind of use it as a press to push this out. However, I don't do that. I usually can get these off with the air hammer and just using this regular hammer here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera because it's going to be very time consuming and it's going to be very loud, and I'm sure you guys wouldn't be interested in watching me struggle for 20 minutes or so. So I'll be back once I have everything loosened up. Alright, so we went ahead and we have our wheel bearing loose, guys. There is quite a bit of carnage on here, but I was able to get this thing off. Now, just to show you guys what all goes into this, I had to bust out my air hammer, my sledgehammer, you guys can see here. I actually did use my torch and obviously that hammer and a couple, little wedge tools like that. This thing has basically taken me about 20 to 30 minutes here. I've been playing with this thing to try to get it off, and it finally let loose. So now we did have our axle nut here as a safety, and I'm glad it was there because otherwise this thing would have fell straight through. So what we're going to do now is go ahead and remove our axle nut. This is simply on there just to help save our toes, guys. And we're going to go ahead and pull off the backing plate with the wheel bearing. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have my reservations on this backing plate because the metal on it is very thin and weak. You guys can see it's very rotted out. It's very flimsy. I may or may not reuse that. I'm gonna have to give it to the customer and see what he wants to do. If he says go ahead and do so, then I'm gonna go ahead and put it back on there. That's not an issue. But the next step in this, and you guys have seen this before in a lot of my videos if you've watched me, you're gonna go ahead and clean your flange area here and your inner diameter. Just go ahead and get everything cleaned up and prepped and ready for your new bearing. Alright, I went ahead and I cleaned up my whole hub flange, guys, and I don't show this really on camera because I've done this so many times, but you just take your wire wheel, clean up the front surface, which would be right here, and I try to get this beveled area in here. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit difficult to install, and you don't want to have any surface rust causing an uneven bearing placement. Now, as far as the internal structure on here, there's no way to really clean that up. The axle's in the way. If the axle wasn't there, you may be able to get your wire wheel or whiz wheel in there, but in this scenario, it's not even justifiable or doable. So what I do after I clean it up is I take my brake cleaner and I just give this a nice cleaning. Try to be very thorough. Get off any dust or any sort of debris that may be in there. And the main reason why I like doing it this way is because I actually do wind up spraying either penetrating oil or some sort of anti-corrosion product in there that's oil based. In today's scenario, we're going to be using fluid film simply because this is a plow truck, so this is going to be susceptible to a lot of rust. So we're going to take our air and clean it up. And we're just looking to dry everything up simply because you don't want to have any brake cleaner and then spray fluid film. It's not really going to stick too well. Now what you're going to want to do is take your can of whatever product you want if you're going to be doing this and just go ahead and give it a nice dousing. I'd say right about there is good. You just want to get it covered up so that way you can try to prevent any sort of corrosion. Because knowing this truck and the way it's getting used, this thing will be chewing through wheel bearings quite often. So that's why it's always good to kind of cover your bases, especially if you're going to be seeing the vehicle that you're working on consistently and you may, have to do something. It's always good to cover it. And even for the next guy, guys, if even, let's say, 40,000 miles on the road, someone else does the wheel bearings on this, at least it'll be easier. They don't have to fight it. Alright guys, so I kind of screwed up a little bit here. I thought I hit the record button when I went to go place my bearing and backing plate on here. Unfortunately, my camera was not recording when I did it. So what I did here, just to kind of reiterate, was I put my bolts in through the back, put my backing plate on, then I took my wheel bearing, lined it up and held it on this side and just kind of sandwiched it together till everything got lined up and I was able to get a couple threads on all the bolts on it. Now the next step that everything is sandwiched together, as you guys will see here, the way that it works out to be is you have your bearing, your backing plate, and then you have your bolts in the back. So everything is all in one. What I'm going to do next, and I'm probably not going to show this step, is I'm going to drive the bolts on there. What I like to do is use my electric ratchet just to drive them on, and then I'll go ahead and I'll torque them on there. So I'm going to go ahead and do that off camera like I always do, just because it's needless for me to show you tightening up bolts. And the way you gain access to them is basically you get two on this side and then two from the back side. It's really easy, especially since we don't have the steering linkage hooked up, so we could just spin this however we want. So let me go ahead and get that done. I'll be right back with you guys. So we went ahead and we tightened up our wheel bearing, guys, but I do want to mention that this truck is getting both wheel bearings done on the front. I've already gone ahead and done the other side, and there's not going to be a video. They're identically the same. The backing plate on that side was really, really bad. It was really rotted. And on this side, even though it was savable, I don't like running them, with or without them. So I called up the customer again and I explained the situation to him, and I told him how long it would take to get new backing plates ordered from GM or wherever I could get them, and it was simply too long. He needs his truck back. So customer opted to go ahead and replace the bearings and not put the shield back on. I will be honest with you, whether you have it or don't, it's not really going to make too big of a difference. The reason why that shield is there is just to help protect any salt or road debris or anything get in the way of the rotor surface. not having it isn't really gonna make it or break it. Although it did come there from the factory, so I do prefer to put them back when that is the case. But unfortunately, in the scenario, we just don't have that option because the customer can't wait that long for them to be ordered up and get delivered here. What we're going to be doing next is go ahead and reinstall our brakes, and we're just going to grab our rotor. Now before I put my rotor on there, one thing that I will do to this truck that I don't do on a lot of trucks, simply because I don't feel there's a need for it, but I will put a little bit of fluid film on this, just between the rotor and the hub, just to protect it from really seizing on there, because this thing will eventually need to get new brakes, just to make it easy for me next time, or make it easy for the next guy who's going to be working on it. Never ever assume that you're always going to be working on it. The next step in this is we're going to go ahead and reinstall our rotor here, and we're going to take our caliper and we are also going to reinstall that. Let me just get a few things out of the way there. The ABS wire was in the way. Want to make sure that doesn't get mixed into the caliper area, because you will wind up damaging it. So now that I have my rotor and my caliper set on there, I'm just going to go ahead and install my 2 bolts that retain my caliper bracket into place, and I'll be right back with you guys. Alright guys, now that everything is set up and bolted up, I went ahead and got my rotor and my caliper. Everything is nice and tight. What I'm going to do is start running my ABS wire. Now, the ABS wire should come with these clips automatically, and the way these work is they just clip into the corresponding places. Now, make sure that you remember which way they go, because this can go either way on one side or the other. In this scenario, these just go right up to here. As you guys can see, it's not really a hard pattern. It's all within the control arm and the shock tower area. Now this one up here, there must be a little bit of something left in here, because it is fighting me. So let me just grab my pocket knife and push it out. And sometimes if you can't push it in, the hole may be blocked up. It's because this Christmas tree portion, the male end that'll go in there, is probably still stuck in there if it broke off. A lot of them always tend to break off. They don't really come off that easy. So be mindful of that. And then what we're going to do is go ahead and clip our connector back up top. I do apologize that I don't have you guys up here, but it's just a very simple 2-wire connection here. You just line it up and snap it together. Having a little trouble on mine, but there you go. And then once you connect that, your ABS wire is all said and done. Now the next step that we're going to have to do on this is go ahead and take your axle washer that we had taken off and your axle nut, and we're going to go ahead and hand thread it on here. Now the way I like to do this is I will use my baby impact to drive it all the way in and not tighten it with it, just use it to drive it, and we actually do torque these on. So this gun is capable of doing around, I want to say, 100 foot-pounds. This bolt, according to the manufacturer of the bearing that I'm using as a reference, takes about double that. It's around 180 or 177. So this gun will not over tighten it. And what I'm going to do now is go ahead and get my axle bolt tightened up. And we're going to go ahead and do that on camera, because as you guys know, I don't really show you guys torque specs and things like that. But the way that I do torque this on and keep the wheel from moving, just to show you guys a little bit of a snippet here. If you put on your torque wrench here and you try to tighten it, this rotor is going to want to move. The way I combat that is I just take a screwdriver, a flathead, and I will just place it in the fin of the rotor right there, and therefore it'll lock it in. So now you can go ahead and tighten that. So let me grab my torque wrench and stuff, get that bolt snugged up, and I'll be right back with you guys. Alright guys, so I went ahead and I got my axle nut fastened on there, and I went ahead and I sprayed it with some anti-corrosion spray there. That's fluid film that I'm using. Now I will say, you guys have seen me do hub bearings before in videos like this, and I don't use this stuff, and those of you that have watched those videos will say, Mike, how come you didn't use it on that Honda Civic or that Hyundai? Here's the thing guys, this thing is a plow truck. When it comes to a lot of these trucks that are used in the winter that I'll be using for plowing and stuff like that, What I typically do is take the extra measure to spray anti-corrosive chemicals on there as I'm working on it, simply because these things do break down quite a bit, and if I'm replacing something new and I want to be able to service it later on, or let's say the customer wants to service it later on, I like to give them the ability to not fight it, because this may have to be replaced again in let's say another 5 or 6 years. Why should they struggle? Every little thing that I could take care of now to make it easier is definitely worth it, especially if it doesn't really take me that long. It just takes me a couple seconds of spraying a chemical. So now that we've sprayed it and tightened it, we're gonna take our cap. I went ahead and I straightened out the little bend that we did on here before, so everything is nice and flat. And what we're gonna do now is go ahead and line this up, and we're just simply going to tap it back into place. Now make sure you go evenly on this, guys. You don't want to just kind of hit it on one side because it won't go on evenly. But I'm going to go ahead and make a little bit more noise here and do it off camera. But you guys essentially saw how I did it right now. You're just going to need a little bit more hits that I don't want to do on camera simply because it's going to be too loud for the microphone. Alrighty, so now that I went ahead and got my cap pushed in, one thing that I like to do just as an extra precaution is I take a little bit of wheel bearing grease, and what I do is I will just kind of move my finger around with the wheel bearing grease here and introduce it to the opening of where the cap goes. The reason why I do this is that grease will form like a little bit of a barrier seal if in case the cap is not sealing correctly. Now I did make sure to bend this back and correct it, and we really didn't hurt the inner lip. It's just the inner lip that got a little bit bent up when we removed it. But this is just extra precaution that I like to take. And then what I do is I'll take a little rag and clean up the excess. You're just trying to fit it in between any crevices if there are any that may potentially be exposed to water. Nothing real crazy here, guys. Just a little gentle amount will do the trick. So now that we have that done, we are going to remove our screwdriver that we jammed up our rotor with, and now you guys can see everything is going really good. And don't mind it making a little bit of noise right now because the brake pads are not compressed in there, they're just loose. That's why it's making that noise. Next stage is go ahead and take your outer tie rod that we removed earlier, and we're gonna go ahead and put that back on. Now I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this off camera, guys, but that's how you do a wheel bearing on these Chevy trucks. They're pretty easy to do. They don't really take a lot of steps. It's just on this one we had to fight a lot of rust. Alright guys, so that's how you replace a wheel bearing on a GM truck. Now this application will actually correspond to a lot of years of GM vehicles, including Chevys, GMCs. They're pretty much all the same thing. The heavy duty versions, like this particular truck, they normally have 4 bolts that hold the bearing into place, and the other ones will typically have 3. It just really depends on what you have. Most 1500s are 3 bolt, unless you happen to have a, I believe it's Sierra 1500 heavy duty, then it's built like this one if I don't mistakenly recall. But either way, this will work on any platform GM vehicle with 4-wheel drive. And I do have another video out that shows you how to do a rear-wheel drive GM product, same exact job. And the only difference is that you don't have to remove the cap and there's no axle in the way, but otherwise it's very identical. There's no big difference to it. So hopefully this video helps you guys out. Please comment, like, and subscribe because it definitely helps the channel grow. And until the next repair, I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you guys on the next repair.